The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sandy Adams from the Center for Financial Planning, and I'm joined today by Dr. Peter Lichtenberg from the Wayne State University Institute of Gerontology. We're here today to talk about grief and healing. Our presentation today will last about 45 minutes, and just as a reminder, we will not be able to take questions during the broadcast, but if you do have questions, please do send them in to either of us. Our information will be available at the end of the presentation, and we will be happy to get back to you afterwards. Again, my name is Sandy Adams, and I'm here with Dr. Peter Lichtenberg, who is the director of both the Institute of Gerontology and the Merrill Palmer Skillman Institute at Wayne State University. He's also a professor of psychology and physical medicine and rehabilitation. Dr. Lichtenberg is a nationally known gerontologist, speaker, and author. Most relevant to our topic today is one of Dr. Lichtenberg's recent books, Grief and Healing Against the Odds, based upon his own personal experience with grief and loss. Here today to share his personal insight to help others cope with experiences of grief and loss is Dr. Lichtenberg, so I will let him get started. Thank you for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to share with the audience today. First, let me introduce you to the co-stars of my life and of this story.
Here you go.
Can we start back over again?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. It's
Just go right ahead. There you go. Oops.
I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to share with you some of my story. And I hope that what you'll find is that it's a motivator for you to begin talking about your own experiences, and also that I impart some of what there's known in the field about grief and healing as well. But my story, I want to introduce the two co-stars of my life. And the first is Rebecca Classen Lichtenberg, Becky. Becky was born 2 days after I was. So we're kind of like twins, and we were college sweethearts. She was born in 1959. We were married in 1982, a year after college. And at age 25, Becky passed away. My second co-star is Susan MacNeill Lichtenberg. Susan was my wife and colleague, and our relationship spanned a little bit over 20 years. She was born in 1963. We were married in 1999, and she died in February of 2014. What's so unusual about these two relationships, and as I tell this story, you'll get more of a feel for it, is that both of these women were really everything to me. They were my friend. They were my best friends. They were my lovers. They were my confidants and colleagues. Becky, who of course didn't get to her profession, was actually studying to be a geriatric physician, and she and I were going to go into practice together. Susan was actually my colleague and partner. We published over 30 papers together, and she was a geriatric neuropsychologist. But to get a feel for the life that I had with Becky, you have to kind of see what a character she was. First of all, Becky had a laugh that I've never seen duplicated. It had about 6 different octaves. And by the time she was midway through, shifting gears in her laugh, everybody was laughing with her. And there was never a time that her laugh didn't bring joy to all around us. She really was someone who loved to learn, and somebody who, as a child, had learned a lot. So she would change the oil on her car and other kinds of activities that I was hesitant to try, but she was also a great lover of things like literary classics. We went to Washington University in St. Louis, and we began dating right at the beginning of my senior year. Becky's 2, and we graduated together. I love this picture because in the background is my maternal grandmother, who I was very close to, and who, despite a terrible heart condition, insisted on coming to our college graduation. My grandmother, who really took to Becky immediately, died 4 months after this picture was taken. But you can see we kind of felt like she was a little bit of our guardian angel looking out over us with this picture, that beaming smile and warmth that she had. We were married in Elkhart, Indiana, Becky's hometown. I was in graduate school at Purdue in West Lafayette on a beautiful sunny day, June 19th, 1982. I love to show this picture because Becky sewed that wedding dress of hers, and I still remember she had this very small sewing machine, and she sewed it on this old dining room table that we bought for $6. And just how beautiful the workmanship was. Well, in Indiana was my other grandmother, and really it was very wonderful to be able to introduce Becky to her. My grandmother, pictured here, lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I grew up in Philadelphia, so I didn't have a chance to spend a lot of time with her until I went to graduate school. And we became fast friends, and these two really were Hoosier Twins. So Becky and I were living together, and we were engaged when we first went to visit my grandmother, who said to Becky, "And I'll have the pleasure of your company in my room tonight," which was her way of letting us know that we would not be sleeping in the same room. Well, they pretty much stayed up all night talking to one another, and became fast friends, as you can see. Well, let's put this all in context. So I've been telling you my story, but Daniel Levinson has kind of was the first to really look at developmental stages in a man's life. And he talks about young adulthood pretty much in 3 stages. And the ages 22 to 28 being entering the adult world. And there's 2 primary tasks that he talks about: of forming a dream and forming a love relationship. So I think you could hear in a little bit of what I was alluding to, the dream that Becky and I had, that we were going to work together on behalf of older adults. She is a physician, me as a psychologist and neuropsychologist, that we were going to be able to impact the lives of many people in what we thought would be a positive way. And the reason I showed you those pictures of my grandmothers was that they and my great aunts and uncles were what motivated me from the time I was 16 years old to want to become a gerontologist, because my experiences with them were so positive and so rich, and they were such models of aging successfully. So Becky and I had that dream. We also had that kind of friendship and camaraderie that we knew, would be the bedrock of our life together. On November 14th, 1984, I awoke with a startle at 6:47 a.m. and immediately came into my mind, Becky is dead. A moment later, I heard an ambulance from down the street, and sure enough, that proved to be the ambulance that took Becky to the hospital and later the morgue. Becky had died from her underlying heart condition called idiopathic subaortic stenosis, and while she was out jogging, she died of a cardiac arrhythmia. Her death would have been almost instantaneous, but I think that we were so connected that as she was leaving this world, she sent that message to me. I can remember saying to myself, well, I better jump in the shower first because it's going to be a long day. I can remember then going to look for her just on the off chance that she was around. And then I came back, and as I sat in our one-bedroom apartment, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, which seemed so loud because everything else was dead silent. Finally, I called the police and I said, is there anything that you can tell me about a 25-year-old woman, about 5'4"? No, he said, no, we don't know anything. I was just about to hang up. He said, oh, just wait a minute, sir. And then he said it. We have someone at the hospital, fits that description. Is she living? I asked. No, he replied, she's dead. Calmly, I said to him, I don't think I can drive myself to the hospital. Do you think you could send somebody to take me? Which, of course, they did. This picture depicts Becky playing. We were playing Frisbee. This was actually taken at P.J. Hoffmaster State Park, where Becky arranged for us to go one October for a long weekend. But I always thought of this picture as how it must have been when Becky was found on the roadside just across the street from us. Back in 1944, the psychiatrist Eric Lindemann was the first to really study the symptoms of acute grief during a period of sudden, unexpected loss. This was the famous Boston Coconut Grove fire. It was a nightclub. It caught fire, and over 100 people died in that fire. The physical symptoms, the tightness in the chest and throat, I remember that actually over the first 24 hours I developed a terrible sore throat because I couldn't get enough air to project my voice. I was basically speaking just from my throat. Lack of sleep, tearfulness, and then what people call sort of the waves of grief as things go on past the first day, but during the first month, a real obsession with the deceased, reliving what could I have done differently? What should I have known? Why didn't I realize that this might have been a fateful day for Becky? And guilt. That's a very common symptom. A lot of times, a person dying does so right after a visit from their close loved one because they can then let go when that loved one's gone, but the loved one feels guilty. Why did I leave? I should have known. I should have stayed. I thought the same way. Becky was under a doctor's care, but why didn't I know better? Why didn't I realize that she was so vulnerable? I had no clue, honestly, that she was. That's what shock is all about, and the phases of shock. One thing about it is the waves of grief are very brief. You get very intense sadness, tearfulness, pain, and then that recedes. Things seem normal. If you look around after a service or at a visitation, you'll see one part of the room where there's some crying and hugging, other part where there's normal conversation, and then maybe 10 minutes later, the roles have switched. Those who are having normal conversation are now the ones that are crying or tearful, and the others are calmer. Searching is a very common part of acute grief as well. And I think of searching the way my aunt described it to me. My uncle Alan, was a TWA airline pilot. So for those of you who are listening to this and remember who TWA was, that's what we call cohort effect, because now the younger generation has never heard of TWA. But of course, Trans World Airlines was a huge company, and he flew worldwide. So he was gone many days in a row. But after maybe 4 or 5 days, when he'd be due to come back, she would find herself driving out to the airport, out to JFK, and parking, and then realizing, oh my gosh, he's not coming home. Where does this come from? John Bowlby, who is a very famous developmentalist, actually noted that animals search. Squirrels, he noticed. A mother squirrel who loses her infant and who's disappeared will stay around the area long after it would be reasonable to find the baby squirrel. So this seems to be something that's instinctual in us. It's a mechanism for protecting us. Searching can come the way of thinking you've seen the deceased, actually hallucinating and thinking that you saw their corporal being somewhere. A lot of times, it's misrecognition. You see somebody who has some kind of body, a part or image that reminds you of the deceased. Searching can be in dreams. And the dream I had for Becky for many, many years, actually, a beautiful sunny day. Our apartment was on the ground floor. I step out into the parking lot and start walking towards the street. Across that street is a big hill, which we always ran up. And I get to the street, and Becky is smiling and waving to me and telling me to come up. And I take one step into the street, and she fell down dead. I would have that dream recurrently of that horrible feeling of not getting to her in time. Searching will give way to suffering, and this is usually, according to Lindemann, about 8 to 12 weeks after the loss, where in shock and searching there are periods of protection where our mind may know the person's deceased, but our body doesn't, our heart doesn't. And we still expect to see them. We still expect that to be reunited with them. But in suffering, finally, our mind and our bodies catch up, and we fully know that they are gone. And in this early stage of grief, just a few months in, it can be quite devastating. Now notice this is a time when most of the community has already moved on with their grief. So I can tell you that when Becky died, 25 years old, healthy as a horse, everybody knew her, loved her, both in her hometown in Purdue and our Washington University friends. Everybody was devastated. Everybody. But by the time that my suffering came about, most of those people after the service had taken place, were moving on with their life as would be normal. It didn't mean they'd forget her, but they weren't having that kind of profound sense of loss and hurt. But the person who's grieving is just getting started. So Kubler-Ross, of course, is well known for her stages of grief. Now, she originally created these stages for people who were terminally ill themselves, not the survivors, but the people who were toward the end of life. But some of this, much of it, is very apropos to somebody who's grieving. You should say that the stages don't go in any order, and that you don't go from one to another. You often can go back and forth. So you can think of these as descriptors of different aspects of grief. Denial is one thing that is really misunderstood. People think denial is someone not believing that the person is dead from a cognitive perspective, but that's not at all what it is. People know that very few people are hallucinating that the person is still alive. People know their loved one is gone, but their body doesn't know it yet. And so their brain doesn't fully. And that's sort of the denial that has to, accepting the reality of the loss. We'll see that as one of the active aspects of grieving. Bargaining. I can't tell you how many times I would sit and think, well, okay, I'll give up my life for this if you give me 24 more hours with Becky. Or how about just one more hour? Just one. That's sort of natural in us to try to think all cannot be lost in this way. Anger. I found that probably about 4 or 5 months after Becky died, my anger came out on the basketball court. My best friend in graduate school, my office mate Harold, and I both played high school basketball, and we loved to go once a week to the gym playing the pickup games, and we were very good at playing a pick and roll together and other give and go and backdoor cuts and so forth. But I almost got into a serious physical fight with one guy. This anger came out. I was taunting this person who was much bigger than I was. And thank God for Harold, because he grabbed me and threw me off the court and said, "Get out of here. I need to talk to you later." So anger can come up and be very surprising. Depression, that feeling of emptiness, of hopelessness, of helplessness. We'll see some statistics about depression among those who are grieving. And then acceptance. As people go through suffering, that's part of actually all these stages of shock, searching, suffering. They're all part of how we come to accept the loss and not spend all of our time stuck in that grieving state. Well, in my own story, by the time I left Elkhart, Indiana, I was clearly depressed. And I couldn't process and use the support and love offered by others. Everyone wanted to talk to me about the future, and I hated that nobody would just simply talk to me about Becky. She was still my world. That had not changed. And the physical symptoms of grief were extremely powerful as well. This is very common in sudden, unexpected loss. So let's look at the stress and coping literature, because clearly widowhood is one of the big stresses, the losses of any loved one. It's one of the big stresses. There's a problem with coping when the event is off time. What does that mean? Well, you don't have many peers when you've been widowed at 25. There's nobody else going through that with you. Nobody, it's not in any, as a matter of fact, people are a little bit scared of you because this is their worst fear come true. So the coping is poor when the person is younger, the death is unexpected, and it's viewed as preventable. And Gamino and Sewell did this through reading people's journal essays. Interesting, I really never found a good description of a young man's grief until I read Lincoln, Team of Rivals. Salmon Chase and Abraham Lincoln. Salmon Chase lost his wife. Abraham Lincoln lost a very dear young woman to him, both when they were in their early 20s, like I was. Salmon Chase, I feel the loneliness the more dreadful from the intimacy of the connection which has been severed. In other words, that closeness now was dreadful pain and loneliness. And when you're 25 years old or 23, you don't have the experience of how to cope with that kind of trauma. So 8 months after Becky died, I was leaving everything I knew. I was leaving Purdue, my apartment, my possessions, and Becky's would never be the same. And they gave me a lot of comfort during those months. And really, I went down to Florida to have my internship, and it was definitely the hardest year of my life. And it shows you how much support means during times of grief, because I didn't know anybody down there. This picture is reminiscent of where I would park in the mornings. The interns, like I was, parked out by the chicken coop in the Florida VA, Gainesville VA Medical Center. And I would sit at that chicken coop and try to will myself to get out of the car. Sometimes it would take 10 or 15 minutes. Well, let's take a little overview then of an active view or the tasks of grieving. And these tasks are part of what we call healing. You know, if you get stuck in grief, you're stuck, you're not healing. In order to heal, you really have to keep going and keep engaging in some of these tasks. So the first is accepting the reality of the loss. The second, working through the pain of grief. And I can tell you that for acute pain, that can take much longer than anybody expects. Everybody thinks, oh, a year? Well, maybe 2 years. A lot of widows have told me that the second year was harder than the first. And the third year is a mixed bag. So it can take longer than you think, and you have to be patient with yourself. Adjusting to the environment in which the deceased is missing. So here are the practical tasks. How do you get yourself to sleep without the routine of saying goodnight to your loved one and knowing that they're nearby? How are you comfortable in your home now that your companion is not there? And then emotionally relocating the deceased and moving on with life. So the relationship not being front and center for every part of your day. Still with you, hopefully in your heart in a positive way, but not blocking you from continuing. There's an aspect of grief called complicated grief. And basically, there's two kinds of ways that people have complicated grief. And this is basically getting stuck in some of those aspects of grieving that I've described. Separation distress, just a real preoccupation, loneliness, yearning, searching. In Florida, I definitely was starting to experience that. But the second is traumatic distress, ways in which the individual is traumatized by death, numbness, avoidance, anger. And in many times when there's a sudden, unexpected loss, there is trauma related to it. And it's very under-recognized how traumatic these kinds of losses can be. I told you that we'd get back to depression, and it's really important early in grief not to overreact to the symptoms of depression, like tearfulness or sleep problems or feeling hopeless. As you can see, in the first month, 33% of the grieving widows or widowers were reporting significant amounts of depressive symptoms. That went down to 14% by month 12 and 12% by month 24. But that was still 3 times the rate of the comparison group. One loss brings up other losses, and we have found in research that people who have experienced early losses tend to be much poorer copers with life in general, but also with later loss. Well, I was really floundering and honestly sort of stumbled into a new relationship, and before I knew it, I was engaged to be married a mere 2 years after Becky's death. And while this brought normalcy and routine to my life, Catherine and I really didn't know each other very well, and although we tried for nearly a decade, our relationship was bound to fail. So you have to be careful at how vulnerable you can be after a loss. And yes, it seems so clear that a refuge in a relationship might be a positive thing, but you really have to take your time. Now, one thing that did happen was that I took my first job in Virginia in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley and did a lot of hiking, mostly by myself. Catherine and I sort of went our separate ways and did a lot of exploring. I loved it. It was lonely, but it was beautiful, as you can see. When I came to Detroit, everybody said, "How could you leave that, Peter?" And I said, "Well, look, I'm from Philadelphia. Not everybody's meant to live in the Garden of Eden." Now, interesting about that move is something called the age 30 transition and the role of a mentor. So when I came to Stanton, Virginia and Charlottesville, I came because of this man, Jeff Barth. I met Jeff. He was an acting director of the psychology department. You could say I instantly fell in love with Jeff as a mentor. The two of us talked for half an hour. There was a big luncheon, but just he's the only one I talked to. And I said to him, if I come here, even though you're going to be back in Charlottesville, are you going to meet with me regularly? And he said, sure. Of course, he didn't ever think that I would follow up on that, as he confessed to me later. He said, you just kept coming back, Peter. So finally, Jeff just embraced me with everything. He's still my mentor and really family, and came when Susan died. That actually came before that too, when we were joyful in 1999. It's just after Susan and I were married, and Jeff came for a visit here in Michigan. Moving to Detroit, I also reunited with my lifelong best friend who I'd known since age 4. He was at graduate school in biology at the University of Michigan, if you know anything about that. They tend to stay in those graduate programs forever. So that was good for me because here he was. And I also, there's my daughter from 1992 is when she was born, Emily. So these are the things that sort of Emily's role in bringing me back all the way to life can't be understated. So I did separate from Catherine and suddenly had this charming, wonderful young woman who was a colleague of mine. And as you can see, this is a little bit later in our relationship. She also was a mischievous character and full of life and vitality. And that's my wife and colleague, Susan MacNeill. I love this picture also because it has her handwriting, and because it captures her spirit. I really truly felt that Becky was handing me to Susan. And Susan was amazing in that she really incorporated Becky into our life. And she said to me, well, Peter, part of the reason why I love you so much is how much you love Becky. She also said, I talk to her all the time, Peter, trying to figure out what to do with you, but we won't talk about that. In my new life, and what I felt like was a continuation of the life that I had with Becky, except now with this wonderful person, Susan. Yeah, we did research, we published, we jogged together, we played tennis, we went to the movies. We just enjoyed each other thoroughly. There's our first weekend getaway together in Saugatuck, and I fell deeply in love with this beautiful, wonderful woman. Well, we got married, and then we had lots of changes. Thomas came into our life in 2001, and you can see by 2009 we had also Sophie, and Emily was growing up, and an incredible, happy family. One of the things that Susan and I did more than any couple I've ever known is that we dated every week. We had a babysitter literally every weekend, and one night on the weekend, and also a couple times a year would make for a long weekend to get away. And these were like mini honeymoons for us, and kind of nurtured our friendship and love relationship as well, so that we, despite all these demands and so forth, we kept getting closer and closer. I was at Harvard studying a course on how to become a dean or a provost. It was the second day. I called back to Susan, who was supposed to be having lunch with Emily, to say hi during a break. I heard her voice, and I knew I'd be on the next plane home. And sure enough, she had not only breast cancer, but stage 4 metastatic breast cancer that had already spread to her bones and liver. She was a victim of mammogram failures. She had always had a mammogram, but because of dense breast tissue, it never saw the tumor. Even this last time, when she had 5-6 centimeter tumors, it was only discovered by ultrasound. I could tell you a lot about life with cancer, but that's not what this talk is about. So I'll just briefly say, this picture kind of sums it up, these two pictures. You can see this is the weekend that we spent. We decided to keep this weekend trip. It was about the 2 weeks after she was diagnosed. The alone picture, you can see, if you know her, there's a little bit of fear and a lot of sadness. In the together picture, you wouldn't know that we were dealing with any kind of illness. And we were much stronger together, always, for both of us, and much happier. We were told by the oncologist, we thought for sure Susan was not going to last many months, but we're, hey, no one's dying here today. We have lots of treatments. And sure enough, Susan survived for many months. Our life went on. And actually, a couple years later, she was featured kind of in a very inspiring story by the Detroit Free Press about the ways she coped and handled. And it's only Susan could say, sometimes you wish you could just pull the covers over your head, but then the kids need to get to school and somebody else needs encouragement, so you throw back the covers and get your day started. 44 months she was a survivor, and she was never impaired. Now, Susan was never disabled by cancer. But what did happen was, because of all the different treatments she had, her heart was weakened, and she was hospitalized on a Friday. We expected her to come home on Monday. Saturday night, we were laughing with each other. Sunday morning, before I was able to get to the hospital, they called me and told me she had coded and Susan was gone on February 9th. So I lived with cancer, and I knew it was terminal, and I could tell. I didn't think it was going to happen so soon during 2014, but I did think that 2014 would be our last year together. At Christmas that in 2013, I could see that Susan was starting to feel weaker and needing more rest. But it was just an emptiness and a heartache. There was no trauma the way there had been, and I was able to garner tons of support that I needed and really get the supports in place to help my young family, really. Sophie, who was 9 when Susan died, was 8 in this picture, was 5 when Susan was diagnosed, never remembered her mother working. And Thomas was in 7th grade and was 13. She really gave me the confidence to go forward. Not that it isn't and hasn't been incredibly challenging, but she gave me that confidence to make sure that I took good care of myself. Now, a couple of theories I think are really apropos to the way I've experienced grief with Susan and Becky, but talking about Susan. The 2-track theory. Time on our own needs, that's the healing part, but also molding the ongoing relationship with the deceased. We're now about 4 years since Susan died, and every day I do sense her, and every day I do sort of get some input from her, and that's my ongoing relationship with Susan. Things just get sort of filtered through. Well, how would Susan think about this? Also, dual process theory. Activities that are loss-oriented and activities that are restoration-oriented. Both are present. We don't just let go and forget. That's why these theories came into being. And they're very helpful to realize that you don't have to, quote, let go and have the person disappear. That relationship continues. A couple things about legacy. One is Susan won the Courage Award from Carmanos. And Sophie wrote this. When I found out that my mom had cancer, I was only 5. So I didn't know how serious it was, and it stayed that way for a very long time. But the day she died, I knew I understood everything, how she would always smile, like she had never been sick in the first place, and made me think she makes this world a better place. I read this as part of the acceptance speech, and of course there wasn't a dry eye in the place. I also brought Susan and Becky together formally, and my legacy for them was to name and create an endowed scholarship in their name at Washington University in the area of psychology of aging, geropsychology. Everybody who receives, I've now had 3 scholarship recipients, receives a scholarship, gets this. This was the most important thing to me, this write-up about who Becky and Susan were, who these dynamic women were. Becky died at age 25, Susan at 50, 2 months before her 51st birthday. What I learned. Don't underestimate the power of loss. Have the right person stay with you after the death. And after Susan's death, 2 different friends stayed with me, each for 2 weeks. So for the first 4.5 weeks, I had somebody there who I really could count on to make my life easy. A plan and be prepared, both for end-of-life decisions as well as your estate plan. Arrange the service the way you want it. Without going into details, the service for Becky was not the way I wanted it. Her parents were not very respectful of my role in her life. With Susan, I ended up giving her eulogy as well as had some other people speak, but that was so rewarding to me. I could make sure that everybody could see multiple aspects of this incredible person. If you have children, find a way to keep the routine going. Children really do well with routine, but communicate a lot, especially during the first month with the school, with those who are close to you. On and off, I think finding a professional skilled in dealing with this journey is critical, because you can wear friends out, you can wear family out, because sometimes you just get into a pattern where this grips you, and it takes a long time before the ebb and flow of that goes away. Think about how you want to talk about your loved one, especially to children, and try to view your journey as growth and exploration. Understand that you will come in contact now with understanding the frailties of the human condition, and how can that make you a better person. Affirmation is so powerful, and if you have notes or pictures, they can be so reaffirming. And experiencing as much gratitude as you can in your day-to-day life is so helpful in the healing journey. Do know what depression is and how it differs from grief, because if you get stuck in depression, you're simply stuck. You're not healing. And until you get unstuck, you won't continue on that healing journey. Emerging from grief, different scenes have come to mind for me. And one of them is that early spring thaw. And you think, oh, I'm feeling better again, and life is going to be good, and you start down this path. But again, after Susan's death, I said, okay, now I'm ready to date. It was about 9 or 10 months after her death. Went out on a date. Oh, I like this person. And sure enough, it was almost a similar situation to Catherine in the sense of who that person was. I was much more cautious and much more taking time, and so I didn't get in over my head at all. But that vulnerability seemed to attract the same kind of person. And then the snows come back, because it's early spring and you're really not emerged yet. And they come back and there's a blizzard and you're hurting all over again, until finally spring comes a little bit later. That's sort of my image of some of the grief and healing. Well, healing does involve other relationships. And for me, a very, very positive relationship that I've been in now for about 2 years with Debbie. And it's gone very slow and a very comfortable pace, and kind of building really good communication and making sure it's a very secure, happy kind of partnership. And carrying Becky and Susan and all they knew about me and all they gave to me forward into this relationship with Debbie. Thank you for letting me share my story of grief and healing.
Thank you, Peter. Again, we could not take questions today, but contact me at the center. I can get you in touch with Dr. Lichtenberg if you have questions for him. We always thank you for taking your time with us. Watch for future webinars as well. And as a side note, we always like to inform you that we do have planners here who are specially trained to deal with clients who are dealing with loss and transition, understanding that it is difficult to make decisions right away, and we can work with you. So if you have questions on that note, please feel free to reach out. And with that, we thank you again, and we will see you next time.